Thank you very much. And just listening to Robert, I'm already thinking about commonalities and differences since we study more or less the same time period. And I was very excited to think about these comparisons. I trust it's going to be a very eye-opening discussion. I suspect at the end, since we had a question from Evgeniya, right? So what I want to talk about today is a piece of my book, which was just published in May, which has to do, just to give you a little bit of context here, between 1977 and 1981, tiny Bulgaria, with a population of 8.7 million in 1975, organized according to official figures, and there's no doubt those are, overestimated, but still it gives you some idea, organized over 38,000 cultural events across the world. And this is one map from an official report commissioned by the Sociological Institute of the Bulgarian Communist Party that is showing these figures and their geographical reach. And you can see that these events really spread globally, were organized globally. And what I will be talking about is this piece here, just over 7,000 events organized in developed capitalist countries. And my focus will be on events in the West, mainly Western Europe and the United States. But I think it's important just to keep in mind that this is part of a more global cultural campaign that small Bulgaria was engaged in. Now, again, just a little bit more context, and I'm happy to discuss it in more detail in the Q&A. The occasion for this cultural extravaganza was the celebration in 1981 of an important anniversary. 1300 years since the establishment of the medieval Bulgarian state in 681. And I just want to mention briefly here the fact that there are obviously other examples of other countries, socialist or not, celebrating anniversaries as high-profile events. And I just want to mention here most obviously the Polish millennium in the 1960s, but also at the same time Romania was celebrating an anniversary. And then in the 1970s, I want to mention the Iranian 2500th anniversary and the US centennial. And again, we can discuss this later, but the Bulgarians were very conscious that they were in global competition with these high profile events in other countries as they were staging their own cultural events to celebrate this anniversary. So on occasion of this anniversary, so here I'm focusing on the West, what we are seeing is that Paris, Vienna, London, Munich, New York City all hosted events dedicated to the anniversary, which served to promote the image of Bulgaria as an important player in European history and European civilization, as the official language had it, as one of the oldest states in Europe. And I also want to emphasize here that my focus is on what we might call official culture. And again, we can talk about the meaning of official culture here, but for the Bulgarians, as they were organizing their events in the West, they were looking mainly into high-profile exhibitions, what they called representative or prestigious exhibitions, and then classical and folk music concerts. This was sort of like, the staples of Cold War cultural diplomacy, but you can see here very clearly this emphasis on the shared civilizational heritage and universal values. So what I want to do in this presentation is talk about this renewed focus on cultural diplomacy in the context of Helsinki. As Robert already mentioned, I think that's important for us to actually, keep in mind this wider context. And then I want to examine in some detail the cultural message of the Bulgarian officials and the functions of this cultural message, both domestically and internationally. Because what is very clear is happening is that as Bulgarian officials were exporting culture in the West, they decisively toned down their ideological focus to attract foreign visitors, even though the focus on ideology and the ideological language actually never ceased to be omnipresent from domestic correspondence on this topic. So the core message of the Bulgarian cultural events is reflected in a succinct motto, and again, commonalities with Hungary here: a modern nation salutes its past, sort of like bringing, the modern nature of the current Bulgarian state with its past. And at the same time, Bulgarian officials insisted that Western culture offered for Bulgarian consumption has to be similarly universal, classical, and focused on shared civilizational values. So, and in fact, what I'm showing you here in these images is both the Bulgarians going, this is a picture from Munich, Thracian treasures from Bulgaria in Munich, but then you have the famous Leonardo da Vinci exhibition that occurred in Bulgaria in the late 1970s, and obviously another exhibition of Egyptian art. So you can see here very clearly actually a convergence of Eastern and Western cultural products that were exchanged in the context of the 1970s, 1980s, with a focus on shared historical traditions and universal civilizational values. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that actually the exchange, the cultural exchange of Bulgaria with the West was really shaped by both diverging understandings of culture and converging interests in continued cultural contact. So on the one hand, you have a different understanding of the role of culture in the East versus West. Again, I want to emphasize that I'm not talking here about counterculture. I'm not talking about grassroots manifestations of culture. I am talking about state-led projects of cultural exchange, right? Official culture. So from the state perspective, cultural exchange was something that had to serve state needs, right? Whereas in the West, there was always this emphasis on more spontaneous process of culture as a more spontaneous process of cultural interaction. And what I want to claim is that the way East and West interpreted the role of culture and cultural exchange reflected their competing ideas of state society and human rights. And again, here the context of Helsinki and detente is very important. And this distinction between what the Bulgarians called real culture or real art and mass culture remained at the heart of the Bulgarian ideas of the functions of official culture during developed socialism. So you always have this divergence, this is our culture, this is their culture. So that always remained there. But at the same time, you have forces of convergence that were at work here, because there was a recognition that the success of cultural exchange depended on the cooperation between Bulgaria and its Western partners. And this really created a space for interaction and compromise from both sides of the ideological divide. And really, the end result was a cultural affair that spoke the language of universal human values and common European or even Western historical heritage. And through this cultural project, a small socialist state meticulously cultivated an international image that promoted universal humanistic ideas. Now, just as a reminder, I'm not going to talk about detente, but I think because also Robert made a very convincing argument, how important these contacts across the Iron Curtain were in the 1970s in the aftermath of Helsinki. But what was particularly striking to me as I was doing research on my book is that typically in the literature, when scholars examine cultural diplomacy, they tend to focus on the post-1956 period. But what is very clear to me is that in the context of Helsinki, actually, we have this renewed importance of cultural diplomacy in the late 1970s. So I think it's important for us to actually think and understand the role of cultural diplomacy. We know that after 56, the Soviet Union, United States, and their respective partners in East and West created a rigorous institutional framework for cultural cooperation, explicitly referred to as exchange. But now, in the context of Helsinki and Detente, cultural exchange became a key arena for negotiating differences between East and West. If the Cold War was, in its essence, a struggle between ideas, cultural relations played an important role because they structured the broader framework of political, economic, and military relations. And after 1975, many of the ideas associated with Helsinki were first tested out in the cultural sphere. During discussions of cultural exchange, Eastern and Western leaders continuously sparred over the meaning of key ideas that were important to them, that is, human rights in the West and world peace in the East. And these key concepts became sort of like a symbol for the competing ways of life that each side pursued. And in this sense, we might claim that culture was used as a proxy for politics. And again, I'm happy to discuss, but I want just to emphasize here that there really was a very fluid slippage in the way official culture functioned, a slippage between culture, ideology, and propaganda. And often the meaning of cultural events could acquire really a different nuance in the context in which it was organized. So, in addition to the international context, there were important domestic reasons why culture became important in Bulgaria during this time. And what you're seeing here is Ludmila Zhivkova, the daughter of the Bulgarian communist leader, Todor Zhivkov, who became a minister of culture in 1975. And under her leadership, she embarked on a very ambitious cultural campaign, international and domestic. I also want to emphasize the renewed importance of nationalism, described as patriotism in Bulgaria during this time period, and the important manifestations of that phenomenon as well. And by the way, the 1300th anniversary was definitely an aspect of nationalism, sort of like a manifestation of cultural nationalism. So that's something we should keep in mind. But I don't want to necessarily present this as the pet project of the communist princess, as she was often referred to, because also there was a new generation of bureaucrats and intellectuals, many of them within Zhivkova's circle, who saw this focus on culture as an exciting opportunity to position themselves vis-a-vis the second generation of communist elites that was in charge of the country during this time period. So these were the members of the so-called third generation of communist elites, many of them actually of bourgeois families, they're parents of bourgeois families, who now embrace the importance of culture as a way to establish influence in the state bureaucracy. Now, what was the function of cultural democracy for the Bulgarian regime? I do want to emphasize that for Bulgarian officials, ideology remained an important internal justification for cultural contacts with the West. Cultural activities with capitalist countries were based, quote, on the class party approach adjusted to the concrete socio-economic conditions in each country, end quote. And in this logic, culture was not the end goal, but the tool. The objective was to showcase the achievements of real socialism in our country, and you can see here this quotation, and to show the Soviet Bloc's commitment to the end of the arms race and preservation of world peace. And you have inevitably this sort of like literature that is adopting a scientific language, depicting, the ebb and flows of cultural exchange and trying to rationalize and put it on a scientific basis. And you definitely see this, ideological imagery here that was widespread during the 1970s, early 1980s, particularly for domestic consumption. But ideological reasons to promote cultural exchange went hand in hand with reputational purposes. The Bulgarian cultural expansion and cultural exchange with the West particularly was a campaign of self-fashioning. Basically of a country that wanted to increase its prestige and to be perceived as a global player. And thus, the most acclaimed Bulgarian exhibitions, folk ensemble tours, classical concerts, and publishing enterprises took place in developed capitalist countries. Now, in 1980, Bulgarian cultural experts boasted there is hardly a world capital from Washington to London, from Paris to Tokyo, that had not been engaged in an exciting opportunity to experience the extraordinary traditions and accomplishments of our people in culture and art. And of course, we notice here right away that among the world capitals, all of them belong to developed capitalist countries, right? By the early 1980s, Bulgaria had cultural exchange agreements with 16 capitalist countries in Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, and Australia. And these cultural appearances generated excitement, led to innovation, required investment of money and personnel on a new scale. That was really what was most exciting about doing culture in Bulgaria during this time period. Now, there were differences how Bulgarian officials handled cultural exchange with each Western country, which I cannot emphasize here. So I just want to give you some of the big trends. The Bulgarian cultural extravaganza in the West was vetted at the highest levels. There were these high-profile exhibitions that I mentioned previously that were put together by experts, that were packaged with, glossy brochures that spoke about, the history of Bulgaria, but also about its current socialist credentials. So two of the most acclaimed exhibitions were Thracian Treasures from Bulgaria, focusing on the Thracians as a key element of Bulgarian ethnicity. Again, here the link to nationalism. But then surprisingly for the West, another high-profile exhibition actually had a religious message, and it was called 1000 Years of Bulgarian Icons. It was so successful that actually the Bulgarians, they then made a second exhibition. They just put together a second one so that they can send to different exhibitions throughout the world, because they were in high demand. And as you can see here, the emphasis of these exhibitions was on the glorious history of Bulgaria, one of the oldest states in Europe, a cradle of Western European and Christian civilization. And I'm happy to talk more about that. Now, what's interesting about this message is that actually that was not as straightforward as one might think, because in particularly, and in the eloquent characterization of Radio Free Europe, it irked the Russians. And in fact, this is important to emphasize, that the Soviet Union was not often satisfied with the national/nationalistic focus of these exhibitions, which often claimed that Bulgaria was the premier Slavic civilization in competition with the Russians. So Bulgaria boasted that it was the place of the design of the Slavic alphabet, the place which had launched Slavic literacy and Slavic literature and so forth. And that is something that really the Russians were not often happy about. But in the organization of all of these cultural events, what is clearly happening is that the Bulgarians decided to send their best cultural products to the West. They prioritize sending these products to the West. What you're seeing here is the Metropolitan Museum in New York with a banner Thracian treasures from Bulgaria and the invitation for the opening of that exhibition. And in fact, what my research showed is that the Bulgarians were actually successful at staging this event and managing to project this image of their country as an ancient civilization with pre-Greek and pre-Roman roots, an important player in European history and European civilization. So in the Bulgarian evaluation, the Bulgarians were successful achieving a breakthrough in Western consciousness. And again, I want to emphasize that here what is clearly happening is the Bulgarians are going to the West. They are adopting a universal humanistic language, adopting a apolitical language abroad. So I'm giving you just this one example here. It is obvious that when staging these events abroad, the ideological message was toned down and the focus was on national heritage and universal values. Now, quickly here, I'm going to try to wrap up. Yes, thank you. Just to show you some images for actually at the same time Western culture was coming to Bulgaria because it was an issue of reciprocity. And what is interesting that actually when Western culture was coming to Bulgaria, there was a revival of the ideological language because the Bulgarians were concerned whether their Western partners are going to organize cultural invasion and stage, ideological aggression to try and impose the capitalist way of life. Just something curious here for my Hungarian colleagues, actually on occasion of the days of the Federal Republic of Germany in Bulgaria in 1980, the Bulgarians were actually in contact with their Hungarian colleagues and they were asking for advice because the Hungarians had staged a similar days of Western Germany before the Bulgarians. And the Hungarian cultural experts were giving advice to the Bulgarians to try and basically organize these events through an information vacuum and making the events go unnoticed. They were basically advising them to choose carefully the timing around the holidays and to make sure that there's no coverage of this event. So it's interesting how you have this very sustained actually attempt to manage the message in Bulgaria. And to me, that has to do with these conflicting views of culture, because in the Western conception, what was more important than these big representative events was actually, the constant flow of researchers, visitors, students, the organizations of symposia and courses, the exchange of information, right? That was more important. Whereas for the Bulgarians, it was more important to actually portray a particular type of culture. And to counter the jungle of mass culture, they insisted that in Bulgaria, all Western events are also going to focus on classical, universal, humanistic, what they call the real arts. So when Western art came to Bulgaria, they tried very consciously to package it in this way. So that is the last thing I want to say here. In the end, what we are seeing here is truly the convergence of the core message of Bulgarian and Western cultural presentations in the long 1970s, in the early 1980s. There was the focus on national heritage, ancient traditions, real culture, classical culture. And that seemed to resonate among audiences in both East and West, who found this common language reassuring, appearing, and actually this politically neutral language managed to build a solid consensus between East and West focused on European identity. So I will stop here so that we have enough time.